What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the Eternals. Now, here's the funny thing about this. One of the big on-running theories about the Eternals in the Marvel Cinematic Universe is that they're basically robots who are designed to serve a purpose, and that now that the Earth has superheroes, that their purpose is effectively served, and there's not really a need for them anymore. This story is going to kind of confirm that a little bit, but sort of in the way that you don't expect. But for those of you guys who are really unfamiliar with this, and we kind of talked about this a little bit, the Eternals had been dead for quite some time, and that the Machine, which is a relatively new invention in Marvel Comics, had basically begun the process of resurrecting them in the Exclusion Zone. Now, the Exclusion Zone is a long-standing concept, right? It's how the Eternals usually always end up coming back. But we didn't really know who was killing the Eternals, but we largely believed it was Thanos, because Thanos has just kind of been here popping in and out. And then there's just been kind of like these bodies of Eternals sort of laying in his wake. And the big question is, if it really is Thanos who's killing the Eternals, why? Is it just some basic motivation that Thanos harbors a vendetta against the Eternals? He is basically an Eternal himself with a deviant gene, albeit from a different sect, in the same capacity that like people in Africa are humans, but they don't share American culture. So the kind of question is, why would he be going after these guys, right? What's the motivation for hunting after him? The other part of this is that the Eternals usually always existed in isolation, although occasionally they would cross over with other superheroes in events like the Onslaught Saga, maybe Secret Wars or something along those lines. You never really saw them, really get involved in the affairs of mortal men. For Cersei herself, her big question here is to kind of get involved with Tony Stark to find out what the Avengers know, to find out if there's any information they have that she can gather. Because one of the biggest things to know is that with Iron Man having previously become aware of the fact that the Eternals have basically returned, now it's going to turn into Iron Man, if for no other reason than his own curiosity, exploring what's going on in the world with regards to the Eternals, right? So the Avengers may have done their own investigation, Iron Man, Mr. Fantastic of the Fantastic Four, Reed Richards, they may have done their own thing. So the idea of Cersei is to get what information they can from them, see if she can't apply it to her own information, and then come to a stronger conclusion. The other part of this is, again, the character of Toby. Now, Toby is this person that Ikaris, who's kind of like the main hero of the Eternals, had this premonition about, that he was ultimately going to die. And the goal of Ikaris is to save Toby, right? To kind of keep Toby alive. Of course, with everything popping off, what Ikaris had done is he had tasked Sprite with keeping an eye on Toby, basically making sure that Toby's protected by whatever threats happen to be out there, and that if the time comes when a threat does emerge, for example, Thanos showing up and trying to attack Toby, that Sprite would hold off the force of Thanos as best as she possibly could, and then alert Ikaris, who of course would return and try to understand what's going on here. And so what you end up getting is this interesting scenario where a lot of it comes down to Druig. Now, Druig is kind of interesting when it comes to the Eternals. The reason why I say that is, in the past, he's largely been a main enemy of the Eternals, but it's one of these things where, because of the fact that different Eternals are being attacked, right? Eternals in Polaria, who are not necessarily enemies of Eternals in Olympia, but the two groups don't get along, because of the fact that Eternals are being attacked basically across the board, regardless of what faction they're from, then it's kind of like, okay, all hands on deck, everybody band together, and Druig trying to understand what's going on. But make no mistake, Druig's very similar to like Loki in the Eternals mythos, in the sense that, yeah, he's kind of working with the good guys, but he usually has his own ambitions, his own goals and drives, and he really gets immersed in like subterfuge, things like that. And that's why when he is approached by like Thena and all these Eternals here that are kind of questioning whether or not he had a hand in this, the fact that the Polaria Eternals are dead, that he was a servant of them, and so if he's looking to essentially begin the process of wiping out, quote unquote, all the competition, whatever his motivation happens to be, why not start there and then work his way out into other Eternals? That ultimately they kind of come to the realization they didn't have a hand in it, right? There's nothing about this that he had any involvement in, and the reason they know that is because Thanos appears, and Thanos starts crushing all of them. And that's the important thing to get here, right? When it comes to Thanos, he is intriguing in relation to the Eternals. The Eternals themselves are already hugely powerful, right? Thanos is like a mutant among his own Eternal race, meaning he's more powerful than the other Eternals. And so Thanos showing up here and facing off against these guys, it shows there's not really a whole lot they can do, right? They face off against him as best they can, but Thanos is just too overwhelming and too powerful. Now, this comes from a combination of different things. One, it's the physiology of Thanos, his durability, strength, speed, stamina, all that kind of stuff, but also the enhancements he's made to himself, technological modifications, as well as, gifted enhancements that were given to him by Mistress Death, right? Some measure of immortality or kind of definitive immortality, although recently he's basically died and, somehow he managed to come back here, different things along those lines. The only real savior they have here comes in the momentary action of Druig, who uses his telepathy to kind of lock Thanos inside of his own mind. And you get this amazing moment, right? Where Thanos is like, really? Like, I've matched wits against cosmic beings, right? And he has. Thanos has gone toe to toe with like Galactus, Silver Surfer, people whose telepathy telepathic powers are well beyond that of Druig and the Eternals. And he's like, do you really believe that this little trick will somehow stop me? And the response of Druig is no, but it'll delay you sufficiently enough to where other Eternals can arrive, and then we can all take you down. And he's like, that's ridiculous. Like, I've held the power of the Infinity Gauntlet in my hand and wiped out half the life in the universe. I promise you, I can easily overcome you. And ultimately, while Thanos does get his hands on Druig and in the moment goes to kill him, all these other Eternals start showing up, and Thanos does the only thing he can do, which is basically teleport away. But this essentially frees Druig of any suspicion, right? That Thanos is going around and killing different Eternals. His next targets were these guys right here, and Druig effectively saved the day. And so what you end up getting here is Thena basically saying, like, we have to get Ikaris. We have to go after the Forgotten One. We have to go after Gilgamesh. Now, the idea of referring to Gilgamesh as the Forgotten One who leads the Forgotten is really intriguing here. And this is Kieran Gillen kind of building on some of the concepts of the Eternals over the years, and then making some modifications of his own, right? Gilgamesh is one of the Eternals who's been around for an exceedingly long time, but unlike a lot of the other Eternals who kind of adopted their own names as time went on, Gilgamesh didn't necessarily do so. He's really adopted multiple names over the course of his existence. The big difference here, and the reason why you kind of have them referred to as the Forgotten, we'll talk about here in a second, but before we do, I want to switch back over to Druig for a second, because what we end up having is Druig by himself, and then a portal opens up behind him, only for Thanos to re-emerge. And that's when we find out that while Thanos is not necessarily the one who's killing Eternals at the behest of Druig, that again, much like we would expect from characters like Loki, or a lot of these guys who engage in subterfuge and have their own agendas, that Druig is much the same way. That Druig instead basically asked Thanos, I mean, yeah, sure, there's a traitor among our ranks. The big question to ask here is, why wouldn't you come to me? If anybody's best suited to betray the Eternals and to help you carry about this mission of destroying the Eternals, it would be me. I'm the best person suited for that. So let's work together and see what we can work out. Now, following that, you switch over to Cersei meeting with Tony Stark. And this is kind of a funny thing, because as the two of them are talking, one of the things that she had mentioned to Phastos, really when they were kind of talking before she'd come here, was that Tony Stark's easily manipulated. And that's true. Tony Stark's had a thing for Cersei for a long, long time. But also understanding Tony Stark the way that she does, she's like, I mean, this guy's ego and his lust are like the two big things that rule him, right? Everything else is secondary. So it's very easy to take advantage of that, right? She's like, I'll basically, like manipulate him a little bit. I will seduce him, and then I'll try to find out, what he knows about the other Avengers or information they have that can help us with this goal of trying to figure out, what's going on with this machine or what have you, who's killing Eternals. And then we'll basically call it a day, right? The funny thing here is that, of course, using her powers, she ends up effectively shutting down the nervous system of Tony Stark, and then just kind of says like, I have to make a few edits here, and kind of makes a statement and saying Thanos has been killing my fellow Eternals. Thanos is behind the destruction of the machine, and Thanos will rule the earth when I'm done. And then suddenly she's attacked by the Forgotten One, right? The Forgotten One just comes out of nowhere and immediately goes after Cersei. Now, of course, Ikaris shows up just in the nick of time. When she says like, Ikaris, now I need you, Ikaris arrives here and then basically offers a distraction and starts facing off against the Forgotten One, only for us to find out that what Cersei had done by basically manipulating the nervous system of Tony Stark heard her say, Thanos has been killing my fellow Eternals. Thanos is behind the destruction of the machine, yada, yada, yada. That what the Forgotten One heard is, I'm the one who's killing Eternals. I'm the one behind the destruction of the machine. And so ultimately, this is what drew him out. And it was all really a ruse, right? It was the only real way to get the Forgotten One to show up here, because the Forgotten One doesn't just show up out of nowhere. More specifically than that, the question that always kind of had to be asked here is, if the Eternals are there to safeguard humanity, then who watches the Watchmen, right? Who watches the Eternals? And that's what the Forgotten do. Now, the Forgotten are kind of like the police of the Eternals to a degree, where they've kind of taken it among themselves to ensure that if there are any Eternals that abuse their power in relation to humanity, try to force them into subservience, different things like that, in the same way the Deviants did in the early days of human history, that the Forgotten would kill those Eternals. They would destroy them, right? Because they deviate from their purpose. And so the Forgotten One, Gilgamesh, kind of overhearing Cersei saying, I'm the one who's killing Eternals, I'm the one who's responsible for the destruction of the machine, means that's my target, right? So that's why he went after Cersei. Now, of course, once everything kind of calms down between the Forgotten and between Ikaris, then it's kind of a conversation point, right? Then it's a talking point, right? It's kind of like, okay, let's kind of figure out what's happening and what's going on here. The funny thing about this is that because the motivations and really the purpose of the Forgotten are to keep the Eternals in check, then if their goal is to kill Eternals that basically deviate from their roles, they're the next best suspect here, right? If somebody's going around killing Eternals, then maybe it's the Forgotten and the Forgotten One, right? Gilgamesh, maybe he's the one that's doing it, right? Like, it's literally, I mean, at this point, it's turned into a witch hunt, is really all it is, right? It's a gigantic witch hunt, just going after people arbitrarily because they satisfy whatever motivation needs to be satisfied for why the Eternals think things are happening. And so that's what's going on here, right? Going after Gilgamesh, the Forgotten, all those guys, it's kind of like, you guys kill Eternals, right? You guys are the ones who are responsible for the deaths of various versions of us. Why wouldn't you be doing it now? And if you are, why? What's your motivation? What have we of the Eternals done to basically bring this wrath that you have to wipe out so many of us? What's the point? And the response to the Forgotten is, it's not us. We're not the ones who are killing you guys. We're not the ones who are destroying you guys. That's not our goal and our motivation. Like, that's not the case. Like, somebody else has a hand here. Somebody else is involved here in doing these things, right? So stop blaming us. The big kicker about all this is that when they take him to really an aspect of the machine that the Forgotten one kind of goes through, right? Gilgamesh starts going through and analyzing and saying, yeah, like, it's been sabotaged. Like, any scientist of note would have found this just by looking at it, right? I mean, I even told Phastos how to sabotage the machine. The whole entire time this has been going on, Phastos has no idea how any of this happened. Phastos is like, I don't know what's going on with the machine. I don't know how it's been sabotaged, but supposedly he's been working on the machine trying to fix it the entire time. The reality is he's been trying to destroy it, right? And that's the thing, like, Phastos is just gaining the trust of the Eternals. That's all it is, right? Just kind of building on that trust aspect because he's the most loyal. He's a pacifist. He doesn't like war. He doesn't like conflict. He doesn't like to get involved in massive affairs like this. So Phastos being the one behind what is in effect the deaths of all these Eternals takes all the other Eternals by surprise, right? It blows them away. And then of course, Phastos makes contact with Thanos and says like there's people coming to the exclusion. They'll get here fast. You have to stop them. You have to let me continue my work. Now the question becomes, why is Thanos working with Phastos, right? Like, why are these two guys teaming up? They're enemies, right? Thanos is considered the sin of the Eternals. No Eternal would willingly work with Thanos. So why in the world are they working together here? And so ultimately what you end up finding out is the main goal in the destruction of the machine by Phastos is to destroy the Eternals, but it's not to destroy the Earth. But keep in mind, one of the things that we talked about in a previous video is that while we don't have a whole lot of history about the nature of the machine, in fact, we don't really know anything about it. What we know is that the machine is tied to the Earth. So if the machine is destroyed, the Earth will be destroyed. Phastos doesn't seem to know this. It just seems to be from his perspective that the Eternals themselves are tied to the machine, that by destroying the machine, that destroys the Eternals' ability to resurrect. And then from there, it's just using Thanos to destroy what remains of the Eternals, and then there's no way for the Eternals to come back. So why wipe out the entire Eternal race? Switch over to 1 month earlier when Thanos is basically brought back by Phastos. And what he basically says is like, you work for me now, right? Like, I have found a way to bring you back, but this body is not a permanent body. This is a temporary body. But understand, if you basically fulfill these tasks as I'm assigning them to you, then I will bring you back, right? I will resurrect you properly, and you'll actually be back in your full form with your full power. If you deviate against me, if you violate any of the policies that I'm giving you, if you work against me, then I will destroy you. I will make sure that the body that you inhabit dies, and you'll never ever come back again. And that's why Thanos is working for Phastos, because Thanos, of course, seeks to return to life. It was always one of the contradictory aspects of Thanos. For a person who is so incredibly in love with Mistress Death and is a complete and total nihilist, who believes that life is meaningless and death is the only real valuable commodity that exists out there, why is he always hankering to come back to life? Why is he always hankering to return? It was one of those things that didn't really make a whole lot of sense. You would think that a guy who's obsessed with Mistress Death would just off himself, right? And just be like, I'm gonna kill myself so I can stay with Mistress Death. A lot of that seems to be predicated on the events of Infinity Gauntlet, which solidified this idea that Thanos would go as far as to wipe out half the life in the universe to gain the affection of Mistress Death. That and the fact that he's so popular, nobody wants to see him dead. They want to see him alive. They want to see stories with him. So you kind of end up having to do that, because how interesting could a story about Thanos be if he's just standing around with Mistress Death in the afterlife not doing anything? While this whole great big huge fight is going on between Thanos and the Eternals, they're doing everything they can to face off against him, and they're doing it quite well, right? That's one of the funny things, is that as powerful as Thanos is, one-on-one with most any Eternal, he's gonna overcome them. But given the wide and varying powers that the Eternals have, when they work in unison and they come together, albeit without the Unimind, that Thanos it's a difficult task for him to overcome all of them, especially somebody like Cersei, who has a power of transmogrification, right? Matter manipulation. It's one of these things where it's not easy to overcome that, especially when she can use it to modify the body of Thanos and to cause all kinds of problems with him. Now, Thanos' healing factor, his durability, his strength, and just his general wherewithal, right? His just drive to succeed is oftentimes what allows him to overcome the Eternals, right? That he's just so single-minded to a task, it's wildly difficult to overcome that. The problem, and the one thing that Phastos didn't account for, is that as he begins the process of destroying the machine, that the machine doesn't hold as well as he thought he would. And basically the beginning of the end of the world starts. And so what ends up happening is that as everything starts falling apart, then suddenly the machine it kind of serves its purpose where it basically teleports everybody all over the world. That the machine itself is going awry. It's not supposed to function that way. The machine's broken, right? It's like if your computer gets a virus, I guess, and just starts spitting pop-ups, right? It's not functioning the way that it's supposed to. It doesn't work as intended. And so the result of this is that Ikaris gets to the machine as fast as he possibly can. And then suddenly where you end up having Phastos, who tries to offer some insight to Ikaris on how to fix things, that ultimately you have Druig who pops up and then modifies the mind of Phastos. And so basically this is designed to ensure that whatever Phastos says will not be taken seriously. There's a secret that he holds that he intends to spill to the rest of the Eternals, and that Druig doesn't want anybody to actually know what's going on, or seemingly that's the case. Now, of course, the actions of Ikaris, of course, work in basically keeping the machine contained, right? Keeping the machine controlled, and then in turn ensuring that everything kind of goes back to normal and the world doesn't end, right? Which is pretty straightforward. Then attention turns to Phastos, right? What's going on here? Now, that's where things are intriguing, because the ultimate goal here of Druig is that at the end of the day was to keep Thanos alive, right? That's what kind of goes on here. I mean, sure, it was the secret that Phastos harbors, but keeping Thanos alive was another part of this. And that's why with Thanos being here and them realizing that he was the one who brought Thanos back, it's like, no. To destroy Thanos, all I have to do is just activate the thing inside his body. But before he can finish this, he realizes he can't remember how to stop Thanos. He can't remember how to kill Thanos. And so in effect, Druig has solidified Thanos' full return to the Marvel Universe, or at least that seems to be the case anyway. Most likely in a more stripped down version in terms of power than what we're used to kind of bring him further in line with the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But we don't definitively know that, right? We don't definitively know if that's the case, because even Thanos' current form is left kind of ambiguous in the sense that last we saw him, he had kind of been defeated by Cersei and was just like in this sort of bubbly, weird looking form. And that was basically it. It seemed as though his physical form had been destroyed. But again, we don't definitively know. Of course, we'll find out here in the next story arc. The big secret that Phastos is hiding, though, is the nature of the Eternals, the cost of their immortality. This is a really, really cool aspect of the Eternals mythos, that with Thanos having been defeated, what Phastos basically reveals here is that as far as the Eternals are concerned, that whenever they die, the machine resurrects them, right? They go to they're kind of reborn in the exclusion zone. They're given I guess a duplicate of their previous body, and they're resurrected in that body. But there is a cost to immortality. The cost of this is that where Ikaris had sacrificed his life to preserve the machine does resurrect him, and Toby dies. The person he was supposed to save ends up perishing. That's the cost of resurrection. Every time an Eternal comes back to life, a human dies. Every single time without fail. It's just the cost of eternal immortality. And so in effect, they are designed to save humanity while at the same time consuming humanity each time they're resurrected. Why the machine works this way, we don't know. That's the nature of the machine. We don't really know definitively who designed it this way. Presumably the Celestials did, but it seems kind of weird the Celestials would task the Eternals with safeguarding humanity and then at the same time cost humanity every time the Eternals are resurrected, right? It's kind of a weird thing there. But at the end of the day, Zuros, of course, is brought back, and of course that leads to the death of a human. The Eternals also come to grips with that and saying, or at least as far as they're concerned, and the kind of statement they give to Zuros is, yes, we accept that, right? Like we accept the fact that this is just the role we play. This is the nature of things. But that's the big struggle when it comes to Cersei, when it comes to Ikaris, when it comes to Athena and these guys is, well, we'll bring the Unimind together and we'll convince the Eternals, the rest of the Eternals to understand this is the price of immortality. But the response is kind of given here by Cersei is they don't care. Nobody else is going to care. At the end of the day, the response that the whole belief they have, Zuros and everybody else, is that humanity is beneath them. And so while they wouldn't necessarily let humanity succumb to their destruction at the hands of the Deviants, lest the Eternals face the wrath of the Celestials, that they're not going to go out of their way to protect humanity from like themselves or anything like that. So it's kind of sitting on this sort of borderline between letting humanity destroy themselves, allowing humanity to be sacrificed, and seeing themselves as being more important than humanity. And so the way, this kind of being perceived as the way of the Eternals is really more of a ruse by Ikaris and all these guys. And what they end up doing is actually going to the capital city of Lumeria, the home of the Deviants. They're really their greatest enemy. And in turn, they say like, we come in peace to the changing people. We have no desire to wage a war with you guys. Instead, we want to join you. help us be the changing people too. In essence, Ikaris and this core group of Eternals are turning against the other Eternals. And the intention here is to join the Deviants, presumably to bring the downfall of all the Eternals. In essence, they seem to have bought in and understood the goal and the motivations of what Phastos was doing. And they've essentially come to this realization that the price that's paid for immortality is simply just too high. They're not willing to sacrifice innocent human lives to preserve their own lives. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. I love this Eternals run by Kieran Gillen. It's fantastic. It's really more of a cerebral story, right? It's really more of a thinking story as opposed to like a single action-packed story, but I love the way it's done. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and I will catch you all later. Peace.